Thank you for joining us tonight for our Bible study. We are going to be in 1 Corinthians Chapter 13 here just shortly. I kind of left you hanging a little bit last Wednesday with some thoughts that I wanted to I tried to get through and just trying to challenge your thinking a little bit and didn't quite accomplish the fullness of that thought process. So we'll get back to that a little bit tonight in our study, and we'll wrap up Chapter 13 and we'll move on into Chapter 14 most likely tonight as well, but we'll see how the night progresses. But before we get back into the study, if you would bow your heads with me, let's share in a word of prayer together this evening. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this beautiful day that you've blessed us with, a great opportunity to honor you and serve you that you provide on a daily basis. We just pray that we would always glorify your name, to do all that you would ask of us, to honor our Savior and the great sacrifice He made on our behalf. Strengthen us tonight as we study your word. Give us an appreciation for your message and a strength to apply and to use the things that you train and teach us in through the testimony of the gospel. Thankful for Paul, the Apostle Paul, and his willingness to serve you and to deliver these messages to these churches and these various epistles that we can learn and appreciate your message. Go with us tonight throughout our study, and we pray this through Christ's name. Amen. So, last Wednesday, we were kind of heading towards the end of this chapter, and we were talking about this idea for we prophesy in part, and we speak in tongues, and they're going to cease, and those kinds of things that Paul discusses here. And remember, the intent of that, and don't forget, is that their desire, their focus, their attentions were always about who's got the better gift. So they had created a hierarchy of who the most talented people were based on which spiritual gift they had, and they were being divisive over it, like they were with just about everything else that they had to deal with in those days. And so Paul addresses that fact by basically telling them you could be the most talented person on earth, but if you don't have love, it's what? It's empty. It's empty, right? It's a clanging cymbal, or it's sounding brass, it's noise. But it's not really what God intended, even though it could be great, even though it could be move that mountain over there and you could do it. Or if you gave every ounce of your belongings to the poor, or even if you gave your body to be burned, he said. If it wasn't motivated by love, then all of those gifts, purposes, talents, whatever you want to call them, don't really bring any genuine benefit. Then he goes down that list, if you will, and talks about how these various purposes and abilities, even spiritual gifts, that God intended to serve a purpose, and then what? And then cease or go away, right? They would fulfill their purpose, and then they would go away. And where we kind of left off in our study was trying to ask this question out of verse 10, but when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. Now, lest I forget, that does come on the heels of this statement that he makes in verse 8 and 9, where he says, love never fails, but whether there be prophecies, they'll fail. Whether there are tongues, they'll cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. And so Paul's driving at this basic concept that God will use certain things for a period of time. It'll fulfill its part to lead us to the what? That which is perfect. So that which is in part will be used however long God decides. And once God's achieved that which is perfect, then you don't need the parts anymore. I'm going to share with you a parallel text that I didn't get a chance to get to last week. I want you to run over to Ephesians Chapter 4. And I'll show it to you on the screen as well, but I want you to look with me at Ephesians Chapter 4. And we'll pick up in about verse 12 or 13 of this text. Ephesians Chapter 4, actually in verse 11. So you're going to hear some similar language. Paul wrote to Corinth that there were these works, prophecies, or roles and purposes men would have, but love is above them. Verse 11 of Ephesians 4, he gave some apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the perfecting, same concept word that we're dealing with, the edifying of the body. And then there's an interesting word in verse 13. What is it? Until. Till we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God unto a perfect man. There's the word again. Unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, so that we henceforth be no more children. What did he say over in Corinthians 13? He said, when I was a child, I spoke like a child. See the parallel between what he's talking about in Ephesians and about in 1 Corinthians 13. That we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive, but speaking the truth in love. 1 Corinthians 13's topic. But speaking the truth in love may grow up into him all things, which is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working and measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. There's the theme again, and it's the same principle. What did he say? He said no role was better than the other. Can the eye say, I don't need the eye? Can the foot say, I don't need the foot? That was the way Paul said it in 1 Corinthians 13, as well as some of the things he shared in 1 Corinthians 12. But he's using similar conversation to those in Ephesus. He's just using different analogies, different pictures. But he's pointing to the same concept, that there are roles, works, function that God determines, and when they've fulfilled their purpose, God has the God-given to himself right to do what? Take them away. Once they've achieved their purpose, God has the right to take them away. Here's the point I want us to grasp from all that. Man doesn't have that right. We don't have the ability or right to dictate to God, well, you don't need this role or function anymore, or you don't need that role or function anymore, or you don't... That's not who we are. That's not our place in this conversation. We can see some of those roles naturally fall away, right? We can see the end of apostles when the last apostle is no more. We can see that once that happens, and we talked about it out of the book of Acts last Wednesday, that without the ability of an apostle to lay on hands, then the spiritual gifts, eventually, a generation would go that didn't have access anymore. And so they would naturally serve their purpose and go away or cease. And so, though Corinth may have struggled trying to understand exactly what is Paul driving at in terms of all those details, we've got the benefit of seeing all of it, right? We can see what he wrote to Ephesus. We can see what was said in Acts. We know the conversations that happened in conjunction with or in extra to what he says there in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So back to the concept then. He was talking about in 1 Corinthians 13 about prophecies. The message. Eventually the message will be what? Complete, perfect. Eventually the message will be complete and perfect. He called it in Ephesians 4, he called it doctrine. In Ephesians 4, he said, speak the truth in love. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, the inspired prophecies that would lead us to have this book we call the Bible would fulfill their purpose, but once God has completed the message, once He's perfected the message, once God has provided all things necessary for the saints, Ephesians 4, 1 Corinthians 13, when you parallel them, then God says, why would I leave it? So one of the best descriptions I ever heard in relationship to this was simply this. When you're building a tall structure, you might use a scaffolding, right, as you're going up. But do you leave the scaffolding up once the building's done? No. You take the scaffolding down, right? You complete the structure, and once the structure's completed, you don't need the parts anymore. Right? You don't leave a hammer hanging on the window just in case you want to, right? It's complete. The tools were used, the structure's complete, and the tools are taken away. So it shouldn't be a difficult concept in some senses for us to appreciate and for them to appreciate that God intended for certain functions, roles, and works to lead to something that would be perfected, and once that was complete or perfected, then to take some of those roles and functions away that are no longer necessary. But what stays? Love. That's his point. And I think we miss it sometimes, and we get into all these conversations. Did Paul say that tongues cease and there's no more spiritual gifts? And was Paul talking about... And we get all... Well, I mean, I think that's important to the narrative because he addresses it. And we need to try to come to an understanding that Paul speaks about these things, that when he was a child, he spoke like a child, he behaved like a child, but when he became a man, when he became full of age, he set aside the things of childhood. What's he trying to say? God would use certain things, functions, purposes, to bring the church, the body, the collective into a fullness. And once he had those things necessary and complete and perfected, then he could take all the pieces and parts that he used to get there and take them away. And we could spin our wheels in that conversation the whole time and miss the point. The point is there's something that doesn't go away. And it's love. The points Paul's making with them is not this great theological conversation about spiritual gifts, so much as it is that God has things that are temporary and God has things that are permanent. And the greatest of those permanent is love. We're a little ahead of the text, but that's what he eventually says, right? That may be oversimplistic. I don't know. But that's what I see. I see less of a conversation about what moment in time spiritual gifts ceased or stopped and which one of these stopped when, though I can perfectly understand that that's what God would do and has done. But if I get fixated on all that conversation, I may miss the point. And the point is that there's something great that never goes away, that isn't temporary. And that's faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. I'll pause. Thoughts, comments, questions about any of that?
You just got to remember, what were the point of all the sign gifts?
Yeah.
What was the point of it?
Yeah.
Why did Christ do all the gifts that he did?
Yeah.
To validate who
It was. Yeah.
And, I mean, in Hebrews it says the Jews require a sign.
Yeah.
The body of Christ, we do not require a sign.
Sign. And I think, Brian, I think you're right that we forget sometimes that the Bible is pretty clear that these spiritual gifts and purposes Jesus performed a miracle so that you would know exactly who he was. The apostles had the ability to perform miracles so that you could validate the authority they had to speak on his behalf. There were points and purposes and reasons behind those things. Once those things are evidenced, then the continuation isn't necessary as it relates to that. Go ahead, Bob. I think I saw a hand back there. And the question Bob asked is there a chronological order we can point to that said this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and then it's complete? And it's a good question. I don't know whether you can point to because we don't have any recorded for us, so we can't point to a date and time that says there's the moment where it was all done. I mean, if you take the latter date of the book of Revelation in the 90s, so if you take that late, then you might start thinking about in that time period when the last of God's message is revealed. Again, and again, I'm not trying to be oversimplistic here, but maybe I am. Though that's a fair question, I don't think that's Paul's conversation. Paul's intent here is to not have a conversation about when will spiritual gifts cease. He's having a conversation about some things cease, but love doesn't. It's a much more general purpose in his writing. I'm willing to say that I could be wrong on that. I'm just giving you my take. That my understanding of the text is to understand Paul's greater purpose. And Paul's greater purpose isn't to try to fix a point in time where that one went away then, and then this one went away next, and then this one went away next. That's not his conversation. He's saying there were all kinds of things that weren't meant to be permanent, but there were three things that were. And I think that's the more general conversation. So I guess that's a long answer to say I don't really think about it chronologically, so I don't have an answer to your question in that sense. And that may be a fair concept, that once men have the ability to have access to the complete message, then you don't need continued delivery of that in the same form anyway, not in an authorized form. Yeah, he absolutely did. And Paul certainly, the bulk of what we have in the New Testament is at the hands of, or through the work of the Apostle Paul. And so certainly he was part of that package of bringing the completeness of that message to fruition. Go ahead, Jim.
These people were not showing love in all these different things to other people. They were doing it just to be doing it.
Yeah. And I think, Jim, that really is kind of at the heart of what I've been trying to talk about, is that the problem in Corinth was they envied, coveted those greater gifts to be known of men. And instead of letting their love for man desire, I want to give prophecy because I want to let others know about Jesus. I love the souls of others, so that wasn't their motivation. Their motivation was very, very personal. And that's what Paul's driving at. And it became divisive as well, which isn't love either. Verse 12. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. That's challenging within itself in some ways, but we know the other inspired writers talk about looking into the perfect law of liberty is like looking in a mirror, right? If you look in a mirror and you forget what you look like, it's the same kind of person that looks at the perfect law of liberty and doesn't do anything about it. So this imagery of looking in a glass, a mirror, and during the temporary stages, they don't have all the knowledge they need yet. Eventually, they can know just as they are known. They can know just as they are known eventually, but they're not there yet, and they're working towards that perfection and completeness that they're seeking. And so be cautious, he tells those in Corinth, that we don't miss some things along the way because we think the parts are the whole. The parts aren't the whole. And what may look different right now because you're looking through a mirror, rather than seeing the whole thing or the real thing in some senses, can create a challenge. Sure. And we can make the same mistakes. So, quit focusing on the parts. Quit focusing on the reflection in the mirror. Get your heart, mind, soul, thoughts focused on the permanent. Now abide, faith, hope, and charity, or love. But the greatest of these is love. The summation of everything he just said is found in verse 13. That's the summation of the points he had been driving at all along. And my simplistic mind says, if I grasp that, right, if I can grasp verse 13, then Paul says, I've grasped the greater knowledge that he just imparted. If I become enamored or focused upon all the other pieces and miss out on the abiding things, then I've really missed out on what's important in the process. The concept of love as it relates to our relationship to God is just as vital as it is as we extend it to others. And Bible gives multiple illustrations of that concept. Yeah, it's empty. Go ahead, Bill.
Talked about these three things in verse 13, faith, hope, and love. Someday faith will be sight.
Yeah.
We don't need faith anymore. Someday hope will be reality. We'll realize what we hope for, we'll only hope.
Yeah.
But love will abide forever.
Yeah. And if you couldn't hear what Bill was saying, and he makes an excellent point, that when you think about faith, hope, and love, why is love the greatest of the three? Well, eventually faith will be sight. Eventually all that we're putting our confidences and faith in that is to come will eventually see and experience. Hope is something that you're looking out into the future for and longing for, but eventually it will become a reality and no longer just a hope, but something we're experiencing. But love exists and is necessary in a sense and permeates even beyond. That's right. I mean, you can't have, if God is love and that's our residence, then how could it escape? Any other questions, thoughts about this text? I appreciate all those comments tonight. I wasn't sure how long it would take. I'd really hoped last week to complete that whole thought rather than have to come back and dig back into it. But sometimes best laid plans, just like networks. But anyway. It's a Sunday problem that I've fixed already, hopefully. Grab your questions in. If you have them, we'll run through those real quick. And show them to you on the screen as well. So if I have great abilities but do not have love, what have I become? Sounding brass or tinkling cymbal or empty, right? They ain't nothing. What profit is gained if one feeds the poor yet does not have love? Yeah. Profiteth, let me make sure, but profiteth him nothing, right? Keep that in mind. Somebody might argue, well, the poor got fed, and so they gained something out of that. And certainly they did. But it doesn't benefit the giver in the right way when love isn't the motivation. Define the word charity is used in chapter 13. Love or sacrificial love. Which Greek word is it? It's agape, which is love that is known by the actions it promotes. It's not that emotional love, which is okay within itself, but this is active love. This is sacrificial love. This is what promotes us to do the right things. So then I asked you to define and separate the things love does do and the things that it does not do. And so what are they? Okay, so it does suffer long. It is kind. It does not envy. It is not puffed up. Yeah. I'm sorry, now I'm hearing rapid fire. Say it again. Okay, it doesn't seek its own. It does rejoice in the truth. Okay, it's not resentful. It endures. Thinks no evil. Okay, it's not provoked or easily provoked. Hopes and believes. And it never fails. Never fails. I'm pretty sure we caught him. Yeah. Okay, I think that grabbed those narratives. In question 5 then simply asks, what things shall fail, cease, vanish away? Okay, so he used the examples of prophecies, tongues, and knowledge. And we talked about that most likely is the idea of spiritually gifted knowledge, if you will, not just the idea of knowing something. Will love ever fail? No, it absolutely will not. What is that which is perfect? You're saying you really didn't answer that, Brian. Yeah, that easier. Who is easier? But in this narrative, in this narrative, the context was he was talking about prophecies, the message, and his point was that those prophecies would cease, no longer be necessary when that which was perfect. And so in that narrative, and then you could add Ephesians Chapter 4 and put those together about doctrine and truth that he spoke of in Ephesians Chapter 4 in the very same kinds of languages that I'm comfortable with the idea that he's talking about, the idea of the complete message, the perfected message, that once completed, Ephesians chapter 4 again, unifies the believers. You know, you think about that. You know, it's interesting. I'm going to teach this class all over again, backing you up 20 minutes ago. But Ephesians chapter 4, when you think about that narrative in comparison or parallel, he had that conversation about until we come into this perfect union. Well, you can't have that perfect union until you have a body of faith that all men can point to and say, that's the message. That's the completed, perfected, put all the parts into a whole. That's the completed message that God intends to unify men under. And so I certainly see and feel very comfortable with the idea that may very well be what Paul's pointing at in that text. Is there any need for the miraculous spiritual gifts today? No. We talked a little bit about that, about the fact that they had a purpose. And once that purpose was fulfilled, they're no longer needed. And we answered question 9 then. What significance, question 10, does Paul's reference to being a child and being a man have in this context? What's his point? Once you spiritually, Bible talks about you start as a babe, but there's a point in time where spiritual growth needs to happen in the life of everybody. And once that's been reached, then you become a man in that spiritual sense. Paul says, I don't go back, become a child again. But again, his point is more about the idea of once something has been used for its proper purpose, it can naturally and needfully at times go away, so that the fullness of that which is complete can actually come to the surface. I mean, again, you think about it for a minute, if those things did not cease, then we have a continuation of the message. We still to this day don't have everything that God wants us to know if the parts were meant to be permanent. And that's the challenge of that mindset. That if those parts stayed permanent and are continuing, then you still have prophecies. You still have message of God being delivered. And that challenges what Paul tried to teach those in Galatia. When he tried to imply to them that, listen, there's a fullness of the message that if anybody comes and preaches any other gospel, let him be what? Let him be accursed. But you think about it. If for over 2,000 years there's been new elements of that message continuing to be layered, could any book contain the whole of what God's message was into? And I think there's some very practical ways to see, even contextually we can see it, but even in practical senses we can see how those things would step aside. At the time Paul's writing, did he have a full knowledge?
That's not my fair question. He had from the resurrected Lord. And he said in Timothy and other places, I have knowledge of these things.
Yeah. And so I guess I should have defined full knowledge in a better way. So what I mean, did he know everything? And the answer is no. And would he ever have full knowledge? Yeah. And I think that's what I was driving at. He could eventually come to know those things like we can. What three things should abide? Faith, hope, and love, or charity. And the greatest of these is charity. Or love. Okay. Sure, absolutely, Dan. Sure. So Paul recognized he had not apprehended everything, had not reached the end result of everything that he was seeking. But there would come a day when he would accomplish that. Any other thoughts, questions out of 1 Corinthians chapter 13? Okay, we don't have a lot of time, but let's take a quick look. Get my at chapter 14. So it's interesting because he just got done having this pretty lengthy conversation about where their focus should be. And then what's he say in verse 1? So follow after love. That was my whole point. Chapter 13, he didn't write it as chapter 13, he just wrote the letter. But desire spiritual gifts, but rather that you may prophesy. For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue speaketh not unto men, but unto God, for no man understandeth him. Howbeit in the Spirit he speaketh mysteries. But he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. Now, we're not always privy to, let me just bring your minds back to earlier in our study of this letter. We know that some people at Corinth sent Paul a letter, communication of some type. And within that communication, they asked questions. We know that Paul in this letter is responding to many, if not all, of those questions because he refers to them. But what he doesn't do is tell us what the questions were. So we know he's in a communication exchange. We just don't know for sure exactly what they asked that led him to respond in the way they did. And so he's reacting to the various information that he gets from folks that are there. Remember the house of Chloe that he mentions earlier in the letter. But he makes an interesting point. He says, so if you're going to desire some spiritual gift, then your focus should be on what? And what's the reason for that? Okay, so prophecy, when spoken to men, can edify, it can exhort, and it can comfort. Think for a minute with me. When Paul wrote young Timothy, you recall he told him, preach the word, right? Be in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. Sound somewhat familiar? They're not exact. I'm not saying he said the same verbatim thing to Timothy that he's saying here to Corinth, but he's teaching the same principle. That if you're going to desire a spiritual gift, Paul says, then let's focus on the one that can help people the most. Let's focus on the one that actually delivers a message that can edify and exhort and bring comfort to the hearer. You can have the ability to speak in dozens of languages, but if nobody there can either understand it or interpret, nobody can interpret it, then yeah, you're just it's an unknown tongue. You're just speaking. Yeah. It's in essence, does God need you to communicate in that way with Him? And so Paul's going to emphasize that prophecy needs to be the focus because it's delivering the message that will actually help men. Tongues have their purpose, but if there's nobody present that speaks that language, then what's the intended purpose? It's just a show, and it doesn't have any real meaning. And worse yet, in verse 4, he that speaketh in an unknown tongue, always doing is edifying himself. But he that prophesieth edifieth the church or everyone. Everybody gets the benefit when prophecy is delivered, when the message of God is delivered. Everybody can benefit. But you're speaking in an unknown tongue, you're only lifting yourself up, and you're not benefiting anyone else in that equation. And so Paul's trying to encourage them. Now, go back to what I said 2 minutes ago. We don't know what kinds of questions they asked, what kinds of problems that Paul's aware of there. I'm going to go out what I believe on a small limb. I don't think it's as far out as makes it dangerous, just a small limb. That they got a problem with folks there in Corinth that are just showing up at the services and are just rambling on and on with tongues that nobody can understand. I think that's a fair conclusion. I don't know that Paul goes down this road, right? I don't know that Paul goes down this road just arbitrarily or futilely or without any meaning or purpose to just have this conversation. I think, you keep reading in this chapter, which we've got 30 seconds, so we're not going to get any further in the narrative tonight. But when you keep reading and you keep studying and you keep seeing this message that Paul delivers, and he talks about the disorder that's going on when they come together. You thought it was bad when they started supposedly partaking of the Lord's Supper we saw in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and the difficulties they were presenting to themselves where they were branching out into pockets and over here's a guy that's drunk, and here's a group that's got a feast, and this guy's starving to death, and you've got all these things, and the unity of the body isn't there as it should be. Well, you've got more problems going on in their assemblies that Paul's going to address here in this chapter, and what it is that they can do to rectify or to correct the challenges and difficulties they're having within those things. So I'll leave you with that. Go study 1 Corinthians chapter 14 between now and next Wednesday, Lord willing, and we'll jump back into this whole chapter and look more at this. For those at home, thank you for being with us, and Lord willing, we'll see you at 10 o'clock on Sunday for our worship together. Holy